In the autumn of 1943, in a quiet Quaker community outside Philadelphia, 24-year-old Rachel Whitmore stood before her congregation and took a solemn vow that had defined her family for generations, a commitment to absolute pacifism, to nonviolence under any circumstances, to refusing participation in war even when the entire nation had mobilized to fight fascism. Rachel came from 5 generations of devoted Quakers who'd maintained their peace testimony through every American conflict since the Revolution, who believed that taking human life was never justified regardless of cause, who'd faced persecution and imprisonment rather than compromise their principles. Her father was a conscientious objector who'd spent World War I in a federal prison rather than wear a uniform. Her brother was currently performing alternative service as a hospital orderly rather than accepting military induction. Rachel had been raised to believe that loving a soldier, someone whose profession was organized violence, would be the ultimate betrayal of everything her faith and family stood for. Then, in December 1943, Rachel volunteered with the American Friends Service Committee to work at a military hospital in Washington, D.C., providing comfort to wounded soldiers as part of the Quaker commitment to relieving suffering even while opposing war. And it was there, on a cold January morning in 1944, that she met Lieutenant Daniel Cooper, a Marine Corps officer recovering from wounds received at Tarawa, a decorated combat veteran who'd killed enemy soldiers and would likely kill more before the war ended. A man who represented everything Rachel had been taught to reject, but who somehow made her question every absolute principle she'd built her life around. This is their story, the pacifist and the warrior, falling in love across an ideological divide that seemed unbridgeable, forced to choose between faith and feeling, principle and passion, proving that sometimes war's cruelest power isn't destroying bodies, but shattering the certainties that give life meaning. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more untold wartime love stories about love that challenged everything people believed. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Rachel Whitmore had grown up in a world of absolute moral clarity. Her Quaker community outside Philadelphia maintained strict adherence to the peace testimony, the fundamental Quaker belief that war and violence were incompatible with Christian faith, that even defensive warfare was wrong, that the commandment against killing admitted no exceptions. Rachel had been raised hearing stories of Quakers who'd refused military service, who'd faced imprisonment and persecution, who'd maintained their principles even when society condemned them as cowards or traitors. Her family's commitment to pacifism was deeply rooted. Her grandfather had been a conscientious objector during World War I, had spent years in Leavenworth Federal Prison enduring brutal conditions because he refused to wear a military uniform or participate in any way in the war effort. Her father had followed the same path, though World War I's end had come before his case resulted in imprisonment. Her older brother Thomas was currently performing alternative service as a hospital orderly, the compromise the government had reluctantly allowed for conscientious objectors in World War. Rachel had absorbed these values completely. She'd grown up believing that pacifism wasn't just a political position, but a fundamental moral truth, that violence was always wrong regardless of circumstances, that even fighting against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, evils everyone agreed were monstrous, didn't justify abandoning the principle of nonviolence. But Rachel's pacifism wasn't passive or indifferent to suffering. Quakers distinguished between opposing war and relieving the suffering war caused. The American Friends Service Committee, the Quaker humanitarian organization, worked extensively with war refugees, operated hospitals, provided relief services. Quakers believed in active compassion even while maintaining absolute opposition to violence. In December 1943, Rachel had volunteered with the AFSC to work at Walter Reed Army Hospital in Washington, D.C. The work was controversial within some Quaker circles. Serving in military hospitals could be seen as supporting the war effort. But the AFSC argued that caring for wounded soldiers was humanitarian work, that wounded men deserved compassion regardless of their role in warfare, that Quaker principles demanded relieving suffering even when opposing the causes of that suffering. Rachel had been assigned to work in the hospital's rehabilitation ward, providing comfort and assistance to wounded soldiers recovering from combat injuries. She read to them, wrote letters for those too injured to write, helped with physical therapy, provided the human connection that was sometimes as important as medical treatment. She approached the work with complicated feelings. Rachel felt deep compassion for these wounded men, recognized their humanity, wanted to ease their suffering. But she also struggled with what they represented: organized violence, killing, the massive war machine that Quakers believed was fundamentally immoral. She could care for individual soldiers while still believing that war itself was wrong, that even fighting Hitler didn't justify abandoning pacifist principles. It was in this state of moral complexity that Rachel met Daniel Cooper in January 1944. Lieutenant Daniel Cooper was 26 years old, a Marine Corps officer who'd been commissioned through Officer Candidate School in early 1942. He came from a working-class family in Pittsburgh, had enlisted immediately after Pearl Harbor, had proven himself capable enough during training to be selected for officer training. Daniel had been assigned to the 2nd Marine Division, had participated in the brutal fighting at Guadalcanal in 1942, and had been severely wounded during the assault on Tarawa in November 1943. Tarawa had been one of the war's bloodiest battles, a small Pacific atoll that Japanese forces had fortified extensively, defended with fanatical determination. American Marines had suffered horrific casualties during the 76-hour battle, with more than 1,000 killed and 2,000 wounded. Daniel had been shot twice during the initial assault, had continued fighting despite his wounds until blood loss forced evacuation, had been shipped back to the United States for recovery and rehabilitation. By January 1944, Daniel had been at Walter Reed for 2 months. His physical wounds were healing, but he was struggling psychologically with what he'd experienced. Tarawa had been hell, watching men die around him, killing enemy soldiers at close range, surviving through a combination of skill and luck, while so many others hadn't. Daniel had nightmares, struggled with survivor's guilt, questioned whether he could return to combat when his physical recovery was complete. Rachel was assigned to work with Daniel as part of his rehabilitation. She'd read his file before meeting him: decorated Marine officer, multiple wounds, expected to return to duty once recovered. She'd approached their first meeting with her usual complicated mixture of compassion and moral discomfort. Daniel had been sitting in the ward's common area when Rachel introduced herself, looking out the window with an expression that suggested he was somewhere far away, seeing things that weren't visible to anyone else. "Lieutenant Cooper, I'm Rachel Whitmore, with the American Friends Service Committee. I'll be helping with your rehabilitation." Daniel had turned to look at her, and Rachel had been struck by his eyes, tired, haunted, but also surprisingly kind. "Friends Service Committee. That's the Quaker organization, right?" "Yes. We provide humanitarian assistance, including work with wounded soldiers." "But Quakers are pacifists," Daniel said, his tone curious rather than hostile. "Doesn't working in a military hospital conflict with that?" "It's complicated," Rachel admitted. "We oppose war, but not the people caught in it. Caring for wounded soldiers is humanitarian work, not support for warfare." "That's a fine line to walk," Daniel observed, "but I appreciate it. Any comfort in this place is welcome." Over the following weeks, Rachel and Daniel developed an unexpected connection. Rachel helped Daniel with physical therapy, read to him, wrote letters to his family when writing was still difficult. They talked constantly about Daniel's experiences in the Pacific, about Rachel's Quaker community, about the war and morality, and the complicated questions neither of them could fully answer. Daniel found himself drawn to Rachel in ways he hadn't expected. She was intelligent, principled, carried a certainty about right and wrong that Daniel envied even when he disagreed with her conclusions. And there was something peaceful about her presence, a calmness that helped quiet the chaos in Daniel's mind. Rachel, for her part, was experiencing something she'd never felt before, attraction to someone who represented everything she'd been taught to oppose. Daniel was a warrior, a killer by profession, someone whose survival depended on skills at organized. Daniel felt his heart accelerate. "I've been in love with you for weeks. But Rachel, I don't see how this works. I'm going back to the war. I'm going to keep fighting, keep killing if necessary. You believe everything I do is morally wrong. How do we bridge that?" "I don't know," Rachel admitted. "My family, my community, they'd be devastated if I became involved with a soldier. It would be seen as betraying everything we stand for. My father spent time in prison rather than wear a uniform. My brother is performing alternative service. And I'm falling in love with a Marine officer. It feels like the ultimate hypocrisy." "Then maybe we need to stop this before it goes further," Daniel said, though the words hurt to say, "before we hurt each other more than is necessary." Rachel looked at Daniel, at this man who'd been through hell and might return to it, who represented everything her principles opposed, but who'd somehow become essential to her. "I don't want to stop," she said quietly. "I know I should. I know it's wrong by every standard I've been raised with. But Daniel, being with you doesn't feel wrong. It feels like the most right thing I've ever done." They kissed then, for the first time, crossing a line that both knew would have profound consequences for Rachel's relationship with her community and her understanding of her own beliefs. Over the following months, Rachel and Daniel's relationship deepened while remaining largely hidden. Rachel didn't tell her family. They'd be horrified at the idea of their daughter dating a combat Marine. Daniel kept quiet among his fellow Marines. They wouldn't understand why he'd gotten involved with a pacifist who believed his entire profession was immoral. But the relationship forced both of them to question assumptions they'd held as absolute truths. Rachel found herself struggling with her pacifist principles in new ways. When Daniel described the battle at Tarawa, the desperate fighting against an enemy that had fortified every position and fought to the death, Rachel couldn't easily maintain that nonviolent alternatives had existed. When Daniel explained the strategic importance of Pacific operations, the necessity of defeating Japan to end a brutal war of aggression, Rachel's absolute opposition to all warfare felt less obviously correct. She wasn't abandoning her pacifism. She still believed deeply that violence was wrong, that war caused more suffering than it prevented. But loving Daniel had introduced shades of gray into what had been black and white moral certainty. Daniel, meanwhile, found himself questioning his own assumptions. Rachel's absolute commitment to nonviolence, her willingness to accept personal harm rather than inflict it, challenged Daniel's understanding of courage and morality. He'd always believed that some things were worth fighting for, that confronting evil sometimes required force. But Rachel suggested that there might be greater courage in refusing violence even when facing evil, that maintaining moral principles in the face of threat might be a deeper kind of strength. Neither was converting the other, but both were becoming less certain, more willing to acknowledge complexity, more humble about their moral convictions. The crisis came in June 1944. Daniel had recovered sufficiently to be cleared for return to duty. He was scheduled to ship out in July, returning to the Pacific Theater, likely to participate in the invasion of the Mariana Islands. He'd be going back to combat, back to the role of warrior that Rachel's principles said was fundamentally wrong. "Come with me," Daniel said one evening, knowing the request was absurd, but unable to stop himself from making it. "Not to combat, obviously. But Rachel, when this war ends, I want a future with you. I want to marry you, build a life together. But I need to know if that's even possible given what I am and what you believe." "I want that too," Rachel said. "But Daniel, I can't abandon my principles entirely. I can't become someone who supports war just because I love you. And you can't stop being a Marine just because you love me. We're fundamentally incompatible. Maybe, Daniel acknowledged. Or maybe loving someone means accepting that they're different from you, that they hold beliefs you don't share. But that doesn't make the love less real. My community won't accept that, Rachel said. If they know I'm involved with a soldier, I'll be ostracized. My family will be devastated. Everything I've built my life around will be destroyed. Then keep it secret, Daniel suggested. For now. When the war ends, when I'm no longer active military, maybe things will be different. Maybe we can find a way to make this work, without you having to choose between me and everything else you care about. Rachel wanted to believe that was possible, but she knew that loving Daniel had already changed her in ways her community would recognize and reject. She could no longer maintain the absolute pacifist certainty that defined Quaker identity. Daniel had humanized warfare for her, made it impossible to see soldiers as simply perpetrators of violence rather than as complex people navigating impossible circumstances. Daniel shipped out to the Pacific in July 1944. He and Rachel maintained contact through letters, though Rachel was careful to send her letters to Daniel's family in Pittsburgh rather than directly to his military address. She didn't want her Quaker community intercepting correspondence with a Marine in combat. Daniel's letters described the ongoing Pacific campaign in terms that were both honest and careful. He didn't glorify combat, but he also didn't hide the reality of what he was doing. He fought in the Marianas Campaign, participated in the invasion of Peleliu in September 1944, survived some of the war's most brutal fighting. His letters made clear that he was killing enemy soldiers, that he was good at his job, that survival required embracing the warrior role Rachel's principles condemned. Rachel's letters struggled to maintain connection while acknowledging their fundamental differences. She couldn't encourage Daniel in his combat role. That would violate everything she believed. But she also couldn't demand he abandon his duty or refuse to fight. She settled on expressing love for Daniel as a person while continuing to oppose war in general, a distinction that felt increasingly inadequate. By early 1945, as the war entered its final stages, Rachel faced a decision. Her community was becoming suspicious about her increasing distance from Quaker activities, her distraction, the sense that her commitment to pacifist principles had weakened. Rachel's father had begun asking questions about her time in Washington, whether she'd become too involved with the wounded soldiers she was caring for, whether exposure to military culture was eroding her Quaker identity. In March 1945, Rachel was confronted by her father and the community elders. They'd learned about her correspondence with Daniel, had pieced together that she was romantically involved with a Marine officer. The confrontation was painful. Her father felt betrayed, the elders disappointed. The community questioning whether Rachel could continue to be part of a faith community centered on pacifism when she was involved with someone whose profession was violence. "You need to choose," her father said. "Either end this relationship and recommit to our principles, or acknowledge that you've abandoned the faith you were raised in. You can't love a soldier and maintain Quaker integrity. The two are incompatible." Rachel felt the weight of that ultimatum. Her entire life had been built in this community, but she also knew that her love for Daniel was real, that she couldn't simply end it to satisfy her community's expectations. "I haven't abandoned pacifism," Rachel said carefully. "I still believe violence is wrong, that war causes more suffering than it prevents. But I've also learned that people are more complicated than ideological positions. Daniel is a good man caught in terrible circumstances. Loving him doesn't mean I support war. It means I recognize his humanity despite disagreeing with his choices." "That's rationalization," her father said. "You're justifying the unjustifiable. If you truly believed in our principles, you'd recognize that loving someone who kills for a living is incompatible with those principles." Rachel had no answer to that, because her father was right. They embraced, holding each other for a long moment. When they finally pulled apart, Daniel spoke first. I know what I'm asking is unfair. I know loving me means abandoning a community you've been part of your entire life. I know it means compromising principles that define who you are. If you can't do that, if you need to choose your faith over me, I'll understand. Rachel looked at the man she loved, at the Marine who'd survived brutal combat in the Pacific, who represented everything her upbringing said to reject, but who'd somehow become the most important person in her world. I've spent months trying to figure out how to reconcile this, how to love you while maintaining my principles. And Daniel, I can't. Your father was right. Loving a soldier and maintaining absolute pacifism are incompatible. Daniel felt his heart sink, preparing for rejection. But Rachel continued, "So, I'm choosing you. Not because I've abandoned pacifism. I still believe violence is wrong, still oppose war, still think there have to be alternatives to killing. But I've learned that principles divorced from human complexity become rigid and cruel. You've taught me that people caught in war make impossible choices, that surviving doesn't make someone evil, that love can exist across ideological divides. I'm losing my community by making this choice, but I'm gaining you. And somehow, that feels like honoring a deeper truth than the certainties I was raised with." "What will you do?" Daniel asked. "Where will you go?" "With you," Rachel said simply. "We'll build something new, a life that honors both our experiences, that maintains commitment to peace, while acknowledging that you were shaped by war, that finds a way to exist between our different truths." They married in November 1945, in a civil ceremony rather than a Quaker meeting. Rachel's community had made clear she wasn't welcome if she married Daniel. Rachel's family didn't attend, though her brother Thomas came quietly, unable to completely abandon his sister despite disagreeing with her choice. Daniel and Rachel settled in Pittsburgh, building a life that reflected both their backgrounds. Daniel worked as a veterans counselor, helping returning soldiers adjust to civilian life, using his combat experience to connect with men struggling with trauma. Rachel continued humanitarian work, eventually founding a peace organization that advocated for nonviolent conflict resolution, while acknowledging the complexity of situations where violence had already occurred. They had 3 children, raised them with exposure to both Quaker pacifist principles and understanding of why their father had fought in the war. It was a complicated moral education, teaching children that violence was wrong while acknowledging that their father had been a warrior, that principles mattered while recognizing that people facing impossible choices can't always maintain those principles perfectly. Rachel never fully reconciled with her Quaker community, though over the years, some relationships gradually healed. Her father eventually acknowledged that while he disagreed with her choice, he respected her honesty about the moral complexity she faced. Some friends from the community maintained connection, able to accept that Rachel had followed her conscience even when it led to conclusions they couldn't endorse. On their 50th wedding anniversary in 1995, their children asked how they'd made a marriage work across such fundamental philosophical differences. Rachel answered, "We never stopped disagreeing about war and violence. I still believe pacifism is right. Daniel still believes that sometimes force is necessary. But we learned that love requires accepting that people you care about hold beliefs. You find troubling that moral certainty can become its own kind of violence, that sometimes the most important thing isn't being right, but being human with each other." Daniel added, "Rachel made me better. She challenged every assumption I had about violence and necessity. She never let me hide behind patriotism or duty to avoid grappling with what I'd done in the war. I'm not sure I'd call myself a pacifist even now. But I learned from Rachel that peace is more than just the absence of war, that building rather than destroying requires a different kind of courage, that the skills I learned in combat needed to be transformed into something else in peacetime. Daniel Cooper died in 2003 at age 85. Rachel lived another 9 years, dying in 2012 at 93. Their children found among their effects wartime letters that documented the evolution of their relationship. Rachel's struggle to reconcile love and principle. Daniel's efforts to help Rachel understand what combat had been like, both of them trying to build connection across an ideological divide that seemed unbridgeable. One letter stood out, written by Rachel in June 1945, just weeks before the war's end. Daniel, I don't know how to love you and maintain the principles I was raised with. My community says these things are incompatible, that I must choose. But choosing feels like betraying something essential either way. If I choose you, I abandon the pacifism that's defined my family for generations. If I choose my community, I abandon the man who's shown me that moral complexity exists in ways I was taught to ignore. Maybe the real betrayal would be pretending this isn't impossibly difficult, acting like love conquers all philosophical differences without remainder. It doesn't. Loving you means living with constant tension between what I believe and what I feel. But somehow, that tension feels more honest than the certainty I had before I met you. The story of Rachel Whitmore and Daniel Cooper represents a particular kind of wartime challenge. Not the obvious tragedies of death and separation, but the quieter devastation of discovering that war shatters the moral certainties that give life structure and meaning. Rachel had been raised in a community of absolute conviction. Pacifism was right. Violence was wrong. No exceptions. Meeting Daniel forced her to confront complexity she'd been taught didn't exist. Daniel wasn't a monster who gloried in killing. He was a thoughtful, moral person who'd found himself in situations where violence seemed the only option, who'd done things Rachel's principles condemned, but who remained fundamentally decent despite those actions. Their relationship required both of them to hold tension. Rachel maintaining commitment to pacifism while loving someone whose profession had been organized violence. Daniel respecting Rachel's principles while knowing he couldn't have maintained those principles in the circumstances he'd faced. Neither fully converted the other. But both became less certain, more humble, more willing to acknowledge that moral truth might be more complicated than absolute principles suggested. She wasn't meant to love a soldier, but war has its own rules. It's a story about discovering that the heart doesn't always follow the paths prescribed by community and principle, about choosing love even when that choice costs everything familiar and certain, about learning that sometimes moral maturity means accepting complexity rather than clinging to the comfortable certainties of childhood faith. Rachel lost her community by choosing Daniel, but she gained something too, a life shaped by tension and questioning rather than by unexamined conviction, a marriage built on honest disagreement rather than false harmony, a legacy of showing her children that moral seriousness sometimes requires acknowledging that we don't have all the answers we claim to have. But this wasn't the only time the war forced people to choose between community and love. In our next story, you'll meet Rebecca Cohen, a young Jewish woman whose family fled Nazi Germany, who fell in love with Hans Müller, a German-American whose parents still supported Hitler's regime, a relationship that forced both families to confront whether love could transcend the deepest hatreds the war had created, whether individual connections could survive when entire peoples were committed to destroying each other.